Bill Speak is joining us now. Bill, thanks so much for your time. I know you got to watch some of that, and I want to walk us through some of the things that we learned today. Of course, we spoke during the lunch break about what happened before lunch, but really everything getting started after lunch with opening statements. And the first thing that we saw was District Attorney Cody Wamp wheel out that suitcase, inside of which they found Jasmine Pace's body. Talk about why evidence like that is brought out in an opening statement. What are you hoping to achieve by that if you're the DA?
Well, first of all, there's a dramatic, sensational part of bringing that kind of evidence out for people to actually look at a suitcase and to visualize a human body being put in there. It can kind of strike a jury emotionally and really focus them to bear down on the case. That's a unique part of this case is obviously the body being found in a suitcase left on the side, by the river. And so bringing it out and showing it to the jury, makes an impression that will last throughout the trial.
Then we got to see some of the arguments laid out from DA Cody Wamp. A lot of these we've heard in previous hearings as they've talked about what evidence they would allow or not. They talked about Chen stabbing Pace 60 times, the fact that Jasmine's family was forced to take matters into their own hands. You hear this kind of repeated over and over, how they tried to ask CPD for help and they just weren't getting the help that they need to or that they needed at the time. A big theme already in this case, Bill.
Yes, and here today was a pretty sensational day in terms of understanding the theory of the case on both sides. We now know from the defense attorney that this is going to be a mens rea case or a mental state case. It's not going to be an identification case. Many trials, it was the individual the one who actually committed the murder. That's a whole issue for a jury to decide. None of that will be on the table in this case. It's going to come down to what was in the defendant's mind at the time of the commission of the act. And so the state is going to be very methodical, as they have been today, laying out piece by piece their evidence. But with the defense's opening statement and the admission that Ms. Chen actually killed her, there's going to be a real fine focus on what happened prior to the killing. The medical examiner is going to become incredibly important in this case.
And that's, the thing that most of us had never heard before. For the first time we hear the defense attorney say, I'm not going to waste your time. He did it. Jason Chen killed Jasmine Pace. But them saying it was a crime of passion, that Jasmine saw texts from another girl on Jason Chen's phone, and that enraged her. And they're claiming, in fact, that she went after him first with that broken wine bottle. So as you and I talked about even before the break, the state of mind. And so he's charged with premeditated murder. They sound like they're going for voluntary manslaughter. At the end of this, the jury can decide either one, correct?
But the difference in punishment is significant. Obviously, with first-degree murder conviction, it's a life sentence. Voluntary manslaughter, they're looking at an 8 to 12-year sentence, for a first-time offender. But, sometimes when you're in a case like this, where the evidence may be overwhelming that the individual committed the act, from a defense standpoint, you then shift your focus to maybe mitigating the damage. Instead of having a first-degree homicide that results in a life sentence, there's a theory to the case that it was done out of passion. And some people don't realize murder is not murder is not murder. There's different levels of murder. They all carry different levels of punishment, from life all the way down to criminally negligent, which is a 2-year sentence. So the defense is making basically they're putting their flag in the ground right now and saying, we're going to go after the mental state, the mens rea defense, and we're going to be looking for a conviction, because they're not going to argue against the conviction anymore. They're going to argue for a conviction, but on a lower felony, on a D felony involuntary manslaughter. It's a very effective strategy, I think, at this point, and it does set up a situation where there was a confrontation that took place in a house, and there's only one individual who can testify as to what happened. So it's a strong way to handle the case. I think from the defense standpoint, it will create challenges for the state. The state will certainly have overwhelming evidence he committed the crime. But now what becomes very important is the actions that he took, that he did prior to the homicide. This is premeditated murder. The things he did after the murder, I hate to say it, but like post-meditated murder, are not contemplated by the statute. That's why the forensic examiner, who's a great doctor, had him on many cases. His testimony is going to be critical because he's going to probably talk about bruising patterns and things that happen. And there's the way someone bruises while they're still alive is different than post-mortem bruising. And so I imagine that's going to become critical in this case to determine whether there was actions that he took while she was still alive that would be indicative of a premeditated act.
Which is why we probably heard a lot in that expert witness testimony this morning before the jury came in about was she shackled before she died or after.
And there'll be a significant fight on that issue. That issue will be one of the core pieces of evidence in this case that'll be litigated by both the prosecution and the defense.
I want to talk next about this woman, Katrina Bean. You can't listen to this or be in the courtroom and not feel for her. This is Jasmine's mother. And I do want to bring in now News Channel 9's Mary Beth Mangrum, who is covering this for us in the courtroom. Mary Beth, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I can. Bill speaks with us as well. Mary Beth, you're the only one of us that was sitting in the courtroom during this testimony of Katrina Bean. Talk about just her anger. You could see it radiating from her, talking about when she was just trying to find her daughter. Can you tell us what that mood was like there?
Right. Well, just taking a few steps back, whenever she was initially first called to testify, Katrina did have to take a moment and step out of the courtroom just to collect herself before she came to the stand. So there was already a lot of emotion present. This has been, 2 years building up to this trial for her and her family. So we did see that in those few moments. She returned to the courtroom, and then throughout that period that she spent testifying, she was very, she was, you could tell that she had been hurting for a long time, is the best way that I could describe it, Latricia.
And Bill, how much does a jury look at Katrina's demeanor, how she reacts to the defense attorney? There was so much talk about when they went in the apartment and what their intent was. How much will that matter here?
Well, I mean, from a fact standpoint, she is basically setting up the case. It's not critical, her testimony, in terms of the evidence they found. It just kind of explains how they got there. The real challenge in having her on the stand, one is that it's the mother, right? So it's a very emotional testimony that you're going to have to go through. From the defense standpoint, it's an incredible challenge because, at the end of the day, there are 12 people that are going to weigh this case, and they're going to have opinions, and they could form negative opinions about the defense attorney, based on how that cross-examination goes. You certainly want to be really, really careful when you're dealing with a family member that has information that has to come out in court, that you do so in the most respectful way you can. At the end of the day, it is a homicide case that your job is to defend your client, but you could also turn a jury against you by being too hostile or too aggressive and failing to realize the humanity really that's being displayed in the court.
And that was one of the things they kept talking about her going into that apartment. The DA said, were you concerned about the police investigation at the time? Because the defense in their opening statement talked about staging the crime scene. And Katrina Pace says, I was just trying to find her. I was insanely scared, which you would think that any mother at that point could relate to that sentiment and that feeling.
Yeah, that's a difficult cross-examination. It's one that if there isn't a lot of value on, you move away from pretty quickly, because the actual content of what she's saying doesn't really affect your defense. Your defense is, more mens rea. There was no premeditation. Certainly, she wouldn't be able to help you or hurt you really on premeditation. If she could hurt you, you'd have to address those issues. But these are very tricky witnesses to cross-examine, and it's not a very easy thing to do in most cases.
Mary Beth, we know you've had a long day in court. Any final thoughts before we let you go here and get ready for court tomorrow?
Right. Well, Judge Boyd Patterson told us that we should resume at around 9:15 tomorrow, so you can expect us to be there in the courtroom. But as of now, no. I mean, we wrapped things up, and they've got it all situated to where we can go ahead and resume tomorrow once we get back in that courtroom.
All right, Mary Beth, thanks so much for your coverage. It's been a long day for many people down there.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bill, the next thing I want to talk about with you, we saw, and you mentioned this, discussion about what happened after the murder. We saw several receipts about what the prosecution is saying Jason Chen bought. We're seeing one here. Some hydrogen peroxide at the Walgreens near his apartment and paper towels, which we soon found out from this man here, CPD investigator Zach Crawford, the reason behind that. Yeah, and then we get into this, which was some of these photos have been seen in court before, this Blue Star technology. Have you dealt with Blue Star in your career before? Can you explain how it works?
Basically, it's a chemical reaction that a lot of times when you clean up blood, there's certain chemicals inside the blood that react to a chemical that's put on it. And when it's sprayed on it, it will reveal the presence of blood, even if it isn't visible to the naked eye. It's very effective at finding blood, and it will find all forms of blood. It's not like you're in a slaughterhouse and you're going to find it as well. But when you find it in an apartment like this, in the theory of your cases, this is where the homicide took place. Even if somebody tried to clean the scene up and then you put the luminol on it, the luminol will show where the blood was. And a lot of times it'll show wherever the blood's at. So you can get a good idea of maybe what happened based on the amount of splatter, the amount of blood that is in a given crime scene. And that can go, towards the prosecution's theory of or the defense's theory of a passion-filled homicide. So yeah, I've dealt with it in almost all homicide cases. You have this product being used. Sometimes they don't find blood, especially if there's a shooting in a car and they want to see if there's blood tracing that, from a crime scene into a car. Doesn't always find it, but if there's blood there, it will.
And what this CPD homicide investigator said, the DA asked him, when did this become a homicide investigation? And he answered, upon the first spray of Blue Star, it illuminated an extremely large area, the most I had seen in my homicide career. And you brought this up a little bit, Bill. More blood, more splatter, does that lend to the crime of passion? And there's so much going on in that moment, but like you said, only one person that is still alive knows those exact answers.
Yeah, there's going to be, obviously, what I would imagine, given the position the defense has taken, that the defendant will testify. I mean, if he doesn't testify as to what happened inside that apartment, then there is no proof of what happened inside that apartment other than conjecture. But I would imagine they're setting it up to where he's going to testify to explain what happened inside the apartment.
And so we saw lots of these photos today. We expect to hear more about this tomorrow. Investigator Crawford still on the stand when we take up the prosecution's line of questioning. Again, they haven't made it to cross-examination yet. Interesting that you say you think they're setting this up that Jason Chen will take the stand, that's your indication from how they're setting it up so far.
Well, I mean, if your position is an opening statement that, there was a conflict that took place in the apartment, the opening statements are not evidence. So the judge would instruct the jury not to pay attention to the opening statement, pay attention to the evidence that came from the witness stand. And so if nobody gets up there and says, this is what happened and this is how she died, then there's no evidence to support a, involuntary manslaughter or a passionate response. So, certainly the defendant has the choice whether he testifies or not. But given the indications that I've seen so far in the trial, I think it's almost certain that he'll have to take the stand to explain what happened.
All right, Bill, thanks so much for helping us walk through this today. There'll be so much more tomorrow, and hopefully you'll be able to explain what it all means. It's a complicated case, so much evidence, and just such a tragedy to watch unfold in these pictures and in this testimony, knowing that at the end of the day, this 22-year-old girl was the victim to a very gruesome murder.
Yes, yes, it is unfortunate, and we are seeing the legal strategies start to play out just as this afternoon.
All right, Bill, thanks so much. We'll see you again tomorrow. And I want to bring now Attorney Bill Speak. He's back with us again today. Bill, thanks so much for your time again as we wrap up some of this morning's testimony. Lots of evidence, lots of crime scene pictures, lots of things that we've seen that the prosecution has gathered and that they found both in Jason Chen's apartment and in the Nolensville home of his parents.
Yes, yes, and in the start of a trial like this, there's going to be an enormous amount of evidence that gets introduced early through the investigators and crime scene detectives, crime scene investigators as well, that is meant to establish really that a homicide did take place, and obviously a location in which it took place. I mean, the testimony about the blood and all that is really to establish where this took place, and there's going to be a lot of very detailed and um, pieces of evidence that get entered. There'll be hundreds of pieces of evidence that they will enter as exhibits, establishing those two particular issues. Now, again, as this trial has kind of developed a little bit, we realize that this is going to be a mens rea, right? What was in his mental state? Did he plan this prior to the actual slaying of Ms. Pace? And so, listeners are really going to be paying attention to any actions he took prior to the slaying, like the stuff that we heard about some yesterday about him purchasing things to clean up the crime scene. Obviously, that would have been a lot more important had he purchased those prior to the slaying. That would show more of the premeditation. So right now they're establishing what they have to statutorily moving forward. But again, this case is going to come down to whether or not there was premeditation in the mind of Mr. Chen at the time that he killed Ms. Pace.
And I wanted to ask you about some of the things that we heard about that were found on his cell phone. We're looking at his cell phone here. It was found in his parents' home in Nolensville. And then, of course, as we see in lots of trials, they went in and got a search warrant for the contents of that cell phone. And I'm not sure if you caught this part of the testimony, but they were going through some texts and showing that some of the pictures that were sent by Jason Chen were actually older pictures. They were taken in the months and in one case a year or two before, but he was sending them in one case to her on the day that she passed away. So maybe possibly showing there that he was trying to show that he was trying to get in contact with her. Is that what that sounds like to you, establishing?
It could be. It could be. It's hard to tell at this point exactly what that could be. I mean, obviously, it could be also him showing maybe communication after she died. It depends on the timing of it, whether he was trying to hide the fact that he was in communication with her, saying that we texted, but we weren't in person seeing each other. So some of that stuff is going to get flushed out. Obviously, what it does show is a relationship. What it does show is, the fact that maybe it makes sense that she was at his house, and there was communication on the day in which she passed, which is important, right? If you haven't had communication with somebody in 3 months and they show up, it's different when you've been in communication with that person on the day that they disappeared. It's another way to tie him to what his attorney has already admitted, that he is in fact the one that killed her.
And then I want to talk to you a little bit about the picture we're seeing now is Jason Chen, when police saw him for the first time face to face. This is at his parents' home in Nolensville, and they talked a lot about his demeanor when they went there. And I'll just read you a little bit of the testimony. The DA asked the CPD investigator, "Can you describe for the jury what Mr. Chen's demeanor was?" Crawford says, "More defensive." And the DA said, "Would you describe him as calm?" And Crawford says, "Yes." And then Jason Chen made the statement to police, "Have you spoken to my attorney yet?" And then they're asking him, telling him they're going to take him to the police station. And another thing that they bring into evidence here, which we've heard in hearings, are some of the notes that they found at his parents' home, handwritten notes that he wrote, the prosecution says, and were written and found in his bedroom, detailing when the last time he saw Jasmine was, and saying that she had a long history of running away. So as they question the police about Jason Chen's demeanor when they found him, what do you think they're trying to show the jury there?
Well, all right. So you have two competing. You have a jury that is going to be shown two different sides of this individual, one by the defense, one by the state. The state is trying to show that he's a very calm, calculating, detailed kind of person, the kind of person that wouldn't just emotionally fly off a handle and commit a murder, but that would plan it, would be careful in what he does, careful in what he says afterward. And it's kind of painting this picture of him as a more of a calm, you know, his actions are determined because they're going to really be focusing on that premeditation. You know, this is the kind of guy that he doesn't do anything spontaneously. Obviously, the defense is going to come the other way. He's emotional and he's reactive to a situation because that's what they have to sell. They have to sell the fact that he reacted to a threat to himself, and he reacted in an appropriate way, but it was a reaction to a threat because he's emotional and he couldn't regulate his feelings. So we're by including some of that evidence by the state that it's putting in, it's showing more of a methodical plan on his part. Now, maybe the plan was for the disposal of the body and to hide his involvement, but it's also showing somebody that is planning and careful and calculated in what he does. And that plays into the theme that he was calculating and careful in what he did prior to his death too, prior to her death as well. And I think that will be a point made well by the state.
All right, Bill, thanks so much for joining us on this lunch break. Hopefully
Absolutely.
We'll be able to talk to you again soon after testimony wraps up for the day.
Very good.
Bill Speak is joining us now. Bill, we're going to add you in here as well. Thanks for your time again today.
Absolutely.
We were just going through some of the testimony of the investigator that found Jasmine Pace's body inside that suitcase, all because of those cell phone records. And Bill, as you and I have spoken, cell phone records becoming a big part of this case.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this case is kind of defining the terms by which the jury is going to have to decide, and that's going to be whether or not this was a premeditated act or whether this was an act done in some sort of excited circumstance, and there was a lot of planning in the cover-up of it. The cell phones and all of those issues that lead to what the mindset of Mr. Chen was at the time of this happening, and shortly before and shortly after, are all going to be used in argument to make either side's persuasive argument at the end of the trial and closing arguments.
Mary Beth, as we've seen today, just a ton of testimony about evidence. Does the jury seem to be just locked into this and paying close attention to everything? Are they taking notes? What does their demeanor seem to be like?
Absolutely, yes. I don't believe I saw a single juror without a notepad in the jury box. And also, one thing that Judge Boyd Patterson said, he actually commended the jury for the insightful questions that they had been asking. And he did say that he will later explain why he likes to ask the jury, why he likes to allow the jury to ask questions in trials. But he did take a moment to really thank them for taking this as serious as he would like them to.
All right, Mary Beth, thanks so much for your insight from inside the courtroom. You're a great asset as you've been there for us today and yesterday. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
And Bill, I did want to ask you, how common is it for judges to allow jurors to directly ask questions of the witnesses?
Extremely uncommon. It's allowed by law. I've been practicing law and doing criminal trial work for 25 years. Judge Patterson will be the first judge that I've been in front of that actually does that. It is allowed by law, and it is insightful. It does give you an idea of where the jury is thinking, where their questions are. So many times as lawyers, we're anticipating what is the important issue for a juror to make a decision on. many times we're wrong because we can't read people's minds. When you allow jurors to ask questions, you start to get an idea of where their thinking is. I thought it was extremely important and insightful when the jurors were asking questions about the wine bottle and whether there were broken glass. You know, if you recall from the opening statement, there's a theory that the defense is going to put forward that this was a result of some sort of a disagreement that escalated, and it involved breaking a wine bottle and using it and threatening it. And sounds to the jury didn't forget that opening statement, and obviously was asking questions to confirm or you know to answer any questions they had regarding any wine bottle that was there, whether there was evidence of it. I think that was very insightful as to where at least those particular jurors are thinking. Keep in mind, these questions come from individual jurors, not from the jury as a whole. So you might have one particular person thinking a certain way, and that's indicative of the questions that's asked. But that doesn't mean the whole jury is on the same mindset.
And one of the other things that we wouldn't have known, at least yet, at least this point, because you don't know what is going to come up, you know, when they call more witnesses later, is the defensive wound, or what the homicide investigator, not defensive wound, excuse me, the wound on Jason Chen's hand, and what kind of wound it was, and if he had any wounds. And once
Sure.
they opened up that question, the homicide investigator was able to give his opinion that it was a knife slippage wound from so many stabbings when that amount of blood happens, which we haven't heard anything about that yet. So that
Sure,
is
sure.
another fact that was introduced just by a juror's question.
Yes, and you know, obviously the defense will have to respond to that in some way. The defense may have an expert that actually has looked at the wound at the time, made an opinion on it, and formed some opinion other than that. But allowing the officer to make a you know almost medical finding like that certainly is going to be impactful to the jury. You know, again, a lot of the evidence that's coming in right now is establishing what the state needs to in terms of that was a homicide, that it did occur here in Hamilton County. It's sensational, but a lot of that stuff that's coming in right now is stuff that the state is, you know, obviously burdened with doing, and they're doing a good job of. The fight is still ahead. The medical examiner is going to be extremely important in this case. The medical examiner is going to have expert opinions on injuries and may have an opinion on whether it's post-mortem or pre-mortem, and those will be extremely important answers for the jury to hear.
One issue I really want to get your insight in is the items in front of this dumpster. So the state, in their part, when they had investigator Crawford on the stand, introduced this picture. It's a dumpster outside of Jason Chen's apartment on the North Shore, and they showed some more closer up views here of these pants that you see and these shoes, saying these were found outside the dumpster and they appear to have blood on them. And at that point, it was kind of left. They did say these shoes that you see, Jason Chen was seen in a surveillance picture wearing similar shoes. So later, when cross-examination begins, the defense asks, did you send those off for testing? Did they show any blood of Jasmine Pace? And the investigator said, we don't have testing from these items. Why would the prosecution show this picture and put these items up that they say appear to have blood if they aren't sure that it was Jasmine Pace's blood, because they don't have the findings from the crime lab?
Yeah, there's a theory that the state is going to be operating with that may not be fully revealed at this point. You know, it is the state came into this trial having to show that there was a homicide that took place at this location. You know, to establish that, they weren't sure that the defense was going to come out and admit that he was involved in the slaying. So, you know, they were going to have to establish a homicide at this location, and showing things like this would have been in their plan to establish that the homicide took place here. The dumpster, here's some what looks like bloody clothes. And, you know, obviously the defense did an effective job of cross-examining. If it is going to be purported to be part of evidence in the trial or in the in your case in chief, then there ought to be testing to corroborate it. And so that, you know, state not testing it may have been a slip, but at the end of the day, we understand there's a killing. We understand that he took extensive measures to cover it up. We're going to keep reverting back and looking for little pieces of evidence that show planning and motive and things like that prior to the killing. That's what this case will hinge on. Some of this stuff is bulk evidence. on things that the jury is already well aware of, that she was killed by him at that location.
Good point there. And then this is another thing that came from a juror question. They said, "Are you sure those are Jason Chen's shoes, or what size are those shoes?" And they put up these two pictures, one from the surveillance video, one from the picture of the shoe by the dumpster, showing they were similar, but again, they weren't tested to be exactly the same shoe. And he said, we didn't send those off for testing. So kind of,
And not every little piece of evidence is important, but what the defense does in a situation like this is try to poke little holes into the investigation to show some question that maybe the investigation could have been handled better. And that opens up argument down the road for more important things that you want to get in front of the jury.
the next thing I want to talk to you about here is the timeline that they kind of established today. So they showed lots of different surveillance footage. This is the first picture that they showed. Jasmine, what they believe was Jasmine Pace driving her car and pulling into Chen's apartment complex on the 22nd late evening. And then after a few other things, they show him, this is him at the Walgreens the next day,
Following
7:03
day.
p.m. Yep, buying those Bounty paper towels you can see in that top left picture there.
Yep.
And then as you get here, I'm going to pull that banner down so we can see. There we go. And then this is where it gets even more interesting, seeing Pace's car, or a car they kept calling it that looked similar to Pace's, leaving Chen's apartment complex on the 23rd at 8:30 p.m. And they kept pointing to who's driving the car. It's someone in a light hoodie. So again, they can't definitively say, right, this is Jason Chen. They're just putting these two little pieces out there for
Sure.
the jury. And then this one, vehicle matching Pace's at the Signal View condos at 8:41 p.m. This is where her family later found her car. And then 9:01, a person in a hoodie dropped off at Chen's apartment complex. You can see that light hoodie there.
Yep.
And then when you get to the next line of questioning, here's a picture of him on that same day wearing a light colored hoodie. So, like you said, little pieces that they can't come out and prove, but is this just planting it in the juror's mind to have them make that next step? Is that kind of how the prosecution thinks about when they're going to lay out these pieces of evidence?
Certainly. And as you know, the prosecution is going to put these pieces together and use it as persuasive argument. There's something called circumstantial evidence, right? Direct evidence is evidence you can, test and see, and as on video. Circumstantial evidence is something that can be inferred. And so what they're arguing here is basically look at the timeline, look at the actions of the vehicle, look at the picture of him, that same day with a light. We're inferring that it's him, and that's allowed, right? And so what they're doing is they're basically giving a timeline of action to the jury. Now, is it absolutely positive that it has to be him? That's not even where they're going. They're saying this all fits in connection with the theory of our case, that he killed her and now he's trying to cover it up. Here he's trying to hide the car, and that's circumstantial evidence of it. It's persuasive, and it'll be argued well by the state.
And I want to ask you one last question before I let you go here. So they talked a lot today with this Zach Crawford investigator, and this is something that we heard in the previous hearings. An idea that he brought up at a hearing where they said, if you had to botch an investigation to save a life, would you? And he said yes. And the defense harped on that a lot about, making sure, were there mistakes in this investigation? And, he said, there are mistakes in every investigation. Were there a lot of mistakes in this investigation? No, not a lot. So this idea that finding her, they were going to do what they had to do, even if it meant later they had to go back and answer some questions about how they did it. Is that pretty common in a missing persons case when you see the investigators put life ahead of these small steps
Sure.
that they're supposed to follow?
Crawford's a good investigator. I've had him on many, many cases, and he's right about one thing. There is no perfect investigation. Certainly there's mistakes that are made. There's mistakes in judgment. Some mistakes are enormous, right? And that can be taken advantage of by the defense. Some is just in the routine, the enormity and the documentation that they go through. Sometimes something gets slipped up, and like I said, I've had him on many cases. He's a good investigator, and he's right about that. Would you save a life would you ruin an investigation to save a life? I would interpret that as, he would save that life and not worry about protocol if it meant saving a life. And I think most people could relate to that. Now, you could interpret it another way. I know I know probably what he meant. And so I understand that statement. He's right. There is no perfect investigation.
Under a microscope in these trials, every step those investigators took, and that's what you see in the line of questioning and then the
Sure.
cross-examination here. Bill, thanks so much. We covered a lot of ground today, and we'll
Certainly.
be back tomorrow when they call some more investigators to the stand and maybe the medical examiner. So we'll see if that plays out tomorrow.
We'll look forward to it then. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Bill, so much. Bill Speak now, joining us from his office. Bill, thanks so much for making time for us again today to kind of walk us through what happened this morning.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Again, this is more of the crime scene evidence that's being submitted. It seems tedious, but again, as we've talked about yesterday, the state still has the obligation of proving, one, that it was a homicide, right, that there was an actual slaying, and also that it occurred here in Hamilton County. When they're showing pictures of the carpet, they're showing all that, they're really trying to establish the crime scene is occurring in Chen's apartment, it gives the jurisdiction to the district attorney, which is a requirement for a conviction. They give the jurisdiction to the district attorney to go forward with these charges. So, there's going to be a lot of this evidence that's going to be coming forward. And right now it may not all get pieced together, but as you move forward with additional witnesses by the state, for instance, they'll find, blood on the carpet, but whose blood is it? Well, some of those questions will get answered with some further witnesses from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation as they disclose the testing done on articles that were sent to them.
Gotcha. And then I want to ask you too, we had a little bit of discussion about the glass, and you and I spoke about this yesterday. The idea that the defense has introduced that this was a crime of passion, that Jasmine Pace came at Jason Chen initially because she was
Sure.
angry about texts on his phone from other women. So they showed the fragments of glass in court today and the size of them and the amount of them. And they asked the investigator, was there a large amount of glass? She said no. Were they, and then they said, do you know where it came from? And she said, I do not. Is this the prosecution being kind of proactive to put in the jury's mind doubt about what the defense says they're going to argue when it's their turn?
Well, certainly it would be to their, benefit to argue that there are shards of glass that may not have come from a wine bottle, because I think it's been disclosed, at least the theory from the defense moving forward is she was attacking him with a broken wine bottle. They may not have sent that off to have it tested to see whether that glass, or whether it could be tested to see if the glass came from a wine bottle, because they may not have known that theory until the actual opening statement by the defense. So, presenting it, to me, these are just, I think it benefits the defense because it does show glass that is broken. The fact that he took such measures to clean up and conceal it, it's not unreasonable to think that he swept the glass up and threw it away. The majority of the broken glass was disposed of, but the mere presence of broken glass, I do think furthers the defense's theory in the case.
And then the last thing that we saw right before the break was the SIM card. And the SIM card we know was from Jasmine Pace's phone. It was found in an eyeglass case at Jason Chen's parents' home in Nolensville. And like you said, they haven't wrapped up all the pieces together. Can we infer, because they're showing us the SIM card, that they might have information from the SIM card of Jasmine Pace's phone that they will later introduce?
Well, that may be the case. Certainly, just the introduction of the SIM card is, bear in mind, when this case starts, the district attorney has the burden of proving the guilt of the defendant. And so they have a theory of the case. They're not privy to the defense's theory, although it was kind of revealed in opening statement where they may go. So, the mere fact that he has a SIM card, would show certain would show his attempt to try to hide her location, to remove it from the phone so she couldn't be tracked. It would be evidence that would be important on the identification of who killed her. Again, that is something that has to be proven, although it in effect has been conceded to by the defense in their opening statement. Again, opening statements are not evidence. So the mere fact that somebody mentions something in an opening statement does not give the jury the information to contemplate that as evidence. The evidence still has to come through the testimony of witnesses on the witness stand. Having the SIM card, I think, shows kind of the methodical plotting of the concealment of the killing. That certainly would be argued by the state, that the same plotting and methodical thinking that went into hiding the event was probably also used in the premeditation. Now, I imagine they'll be using a lot of things he did after the murder to show his mindset of planning and being very methodical. And they're going to try to attribute that to pre-homicide behavior on behalf of the defendant.
And then the last thing I want to ask you about, Bill, is this knife found on the bed of Jason Chen's apartment. We know Jasmine Pace was stabbed. And again, they haven't wrapped all this together. They haven't said that if they believe that this knife killed her. Would they show a knife in court if they didn't believe it was the knife? Is there a chance that this was just another knife in the apartment that they're showing to have a presence there?
Well, it most likely it is going to set the foundation for what they will probably allege is the murder weapon. They could show the presence of other knives, but in particular, the knife being taken in as evidence is just letting the jury know we found this at what we believe to be the crime scene. Further testimony, the medical examiner perhaps might say that a particular wound is consistent with a knife of this size. Things like that is where you build a particular piece of evidence into a murder weapon with additional witnesses that just haven't taken the stand yet. But we'll be paying close attention for those witnesses. The TBI may have taken the knife and done DNA swabs on it, and there may be the presence of blood. And that will come in with later witnesses. But to set the foundation, you have to at least start with, we found this knife in this location, and get that in front of the jury, and then we build on that evidence moving forward. The state is doing exactly what would be expected, for a thorough prosecution at this point.
So this is like a big puzzle, and we're just seeing kind of the outer borders of it at this point.
You're seeing the pieces right now, and as the days and witnesses take the stand, as the days move on, the interior of that puzzle starts to paint the picture of what the prosecutors are going to be arguing in closing argument.
All right, Bill Speak, thanks so much. Hopefully you can join us again at the end of the day to go over some of the afternoon testimony too.
Happy to help.
Okay, thanks, Bill. All right, Attorney Bill Speak is joining us once more. Bill, thanks so much for taking some time to talk about some of the things that we saw today.
Yeah, certainly. Obviously, this was a continuation of the state building it methodically, a case, piece of evidence by piece of evidence. They did obviously address the issue of the knife. That was something to just make sure the jury understood that the knife found at the crime scene is not what they're going to comport to be the actual murder weapon. But this is that part of the trial where there's a lot of crime scene evidence being presented, and they're just being very methodical in how they're putting their case together.
And I want to talk about that knife. We're seeing here a comparison that we saw in court. The knife on the one side of your screen being held by the blue glove, a knife that they said was seen in several of the evidence photos that was entered early on by the prosecution of Jason Chen's room. So you saw this specific knife laying on a bed. And there were lots of questions about, did the TBI test this knife by the defense? Was this sent off for testing? What did they find? And investigators were saying, no, we did not send off this for testing. And then under redirect, the homicide prosecutor gets up and said, okay, but what about this piece of knife? And has them pull out what you see the female there holding, which is what they said, a part of a knife, a broken tip of a knife that was found during Jasmine Pace's autopsy. A pretty strong image that we're seeing there of her holding that piece of knife.
Yeah, sure. And here you're actually seeing kind of, I hate to put it in terms of this, like the chess match of the trial being played out. The defense is obviously, it's defending its client. It's attacking the investigation, trying to poke holes in the investigation and show where maybe they dropped the ball. It's the state's response to those line of questions on cross-examination. The state is now addressing that this is a knife. Don't get distracted by this knife and what they didn't do to that knife. This knife is actually not the murder weapon. Here's the difference. And so they're just addressing a response to the cross-examination that was done earlier in this case.
And Bill, I wanted to ask you about your knowledge about something that was brought up um, a couple of different times, and here we see that knife there on the bed there. But that's the amount of evidence that you can send off at one time for processing to the TBI, and they keep talking about this number of 10. The TBI will take 10 items. Is that something that's common in these investigations, that you only can get a certain amount of items tested at one time?
Well, that's unusual. First of all, with TBI, they're inundated with requests from driving under the influence, blood results, and they have a backlog of testing. Murder cases are high priority, so murder cases get the priority over every other case in terms of testing. Now, one thing I wanted to point out too about that knife, when you see the crime scene photos with the knife in it, at the time this investigation is underway, the investigators don't know what pieces of evidence actually are relevant. So they're cataloging everything. So they're taking pictures. Here they have, noted as, exhibit number 11, they found a knife. They're not sure if that knife is going to play into the story of what happened or not. They're preserving it, and that's just diligent work on their part. The defense, of course, cross-examine them on that issue. That's the nature of the beast. That's the chess match that's playing out in the courtroom. With regard to the TBI, limiting it to only 10. They could do more than 10. The TBI probably would request, don't send us more than 10, but they can test everything that's being sent to them, especially on a murder case. It would be unusual for them to cap it at 10.
Okay, and then the other thing I wanted to talk about is something that we've spoken about in the past, and that's this blue star technology. We see a picture here that the prosecution has entered. You can see that blue glowing go back into this hallway there that's into the bathroom.
Yes.
And upon cross-examination, the defense asked a lot of questions about, could people walking through the crime scene, in this case we know the Pace family was in Jason Chen's apartment before police got their search warrant, could that spread the blood in a way that it would show up in a more heavy-handed way in this blue star technology? Also, could trying to clean blood spread it out more like that? Again,
Yeah.
common tactic just to kind of express some doubt there about what you're actually seeing.
Again, what the defense is really doing is trying to poke holes in the investigation. To say that there's been people trampling through the crime scene, and it could have caused blood to be carried. And all of those are legitimate questions that certainly could be asked. If there was blood on the carpet and it was carried by shoes into the bathroom by people that were searching the home, it would certainly show up with this technology. This technology is very, very effective at locating blood. And so it's going to show up wherever blood was, no matter really, it's really hard to clean it to where it wouldn't show it. It's that effective. But that's the defense. Again, we've talked about this for a couple days now. The crux of this case is going to come down to premeditation. A lot of this questioning back and forth, maybe poking holes in the investigation, saying it wasn't done correctly. Those are effective things, but they're not going to get to the issue that I think the jury's really going to zone in on and really hone in on, and that is going to be the actions taken prior to her death. Certainly, if he was tracking blood into the bathroom, that would have happened post-mortem, you would think, because that would have been part of the cleanup process. But again, at the end of the day, the jury's really going to key in on pieces of evidence that go towards the mental state of the defendant prior to the slaying. This is just investigation and kind of poking holes in it, and this will kind of get washed out a little bit. It won't be extremely relevant, I think, in the jury's ultimate decision. I don't have
Oh, I'm sorry. There
There
you
we go.
are.
There we go.
If you talk about the mental state before the murder, we just had right before the break a forensic examiner, a digital one, talk about this item here, and that's the SIM card from Jasmine Pace's phone that they found in the
Okay.
possession of Jason Chen at his parents' house. And they talked about the data that they extracted from that. So that's something that we can, now that they've entered it into evidence, we're expecting we'll see some of the data that they found on that.
Well, and again, if there's data that's on it that's relevant to what happened, to the mindset of the defendant prior to the slaying, communication that happened before what we would generally consider the time of her death. That's going to be extremely important. What you would expect to find, given the nature of this case, is that there's communication on that SIM card that is an attempt to cover up the crime. I mean, I think that's been very obvious to the jury that the defendant took great efforts to try to cover this crime up. Again, that's not premeditation. That's, I hate to use the term post meditation, but that will not be as relevant. It does show the mindset of him, very methodical in how he's doing this, and you can extrapolate that to say maybe he's the same methodical person prior to it in his planning. But the proof of it will have to come in through the testimony on the stand. Right now, I think we're still waiting on some of that critical proof.
All right, Bill, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow if you're free to talk about some of the testimony that we hear then.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.
Okay, thank you. Attorney Bill Speak is joining us now. Bill, thanks so much. I know it's later in the afternoon than we usually wrap up, so we appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
I want to get right to this TBI agent, Bill, who we just heard testify. There's been a lot of questions about why the prosecution got some items that had blood on them tested and why some of them were not tested, and we may have just gotten our answer. The TBI analyst testified that there is a prohibitive amount of 10 items in cases, but that people can then go, prosecutors that are submitting these or investigators that are submitting these, and ask for more to be tested. Now, upon first testimony, she said that more items were not sent by CPD, which seems to be what the defense was asking and asking and asking about. We go back to that dumpster with the pants that have blood on them and the shoes that have blood on them and the underwear there.
Yeah, and
Then,
that's not unusual. There would be a limit that TBI would have, but there's always an avenue to get more stuff tested. Certainly in high-profile cases, murder cases are given a priority. Upon request of the district attorney, more things can be tested. I'm quite certain a lot more was sent, more than 10 items in a homicide case, certainly in one of this nature.
Right, and that's what, upon redirect, when the homicide prosecutor got back up, he asked her more specifically, we sent 2 batches of items, correct? She said yes. Did you test all of those items? And she said no. So she said that more items were sent to the TBI and some of those items were not tested. I'm having my producer, as we speak, transcribe some of her testimony specifically. It looks like he's just done in our document here about why she said she did not test them. And I want to read this specifically. She said, and this is TBI agent Kim Lowe, quote, I ended up looking at what was there and noticing that most of the swabs originally came from the bedroom or the bathroom. Now there she's talking about Jason Chen's North Shore apartment.
Sure.
So I tested the items that were closest to the bedroom and the bathroom to start with. And then she says, I did not test those swabs, talking about some of the carpet in the other parts of the apartment. Your take on that, Bill?
Well, I mean, you might have 10 samples out of a particular bedroom, different items that are being tested. I don't agree with the TBI's policy that they don't test what is being sent. Prosecutors are not sending them things to test that they don't deem important. TBI should test whatever is being sent. It's a matter of resources. So they're making a decision that they're going to limit it. They might test a few things in the bedroom and find the rest to be somewhat duplicative. But that the district attorney is requesting all of these to be sent, certainly, and you would expect they would be, attorney, there is a policy and there is a budget that does come into play. And so decisions are made, and that's going to be exploited somewhat by the defense, talking about incomplete testing. But, that'll all play out later in arguments.
But what does that mean for the integrity of the case? If they show that Jasmine Pace's blood was on several parts of the apartment, but yet we have some samples in the same apartment that weren't tested, what doubt could that bring to the integrity of the case?
I don't think it would bring significant doubt, because I think it would be a pretty reasonable assumption that we tested several items. These are all out of the same area. They all tested positive for blood. The DNA did match a particular person. It is a reasonable assumption to say that we just didn't. The fact that they were not tested is not proof that it was not present. That's an argument a defense attorney might make, is that it was an incomplete investigation. They didn't test all the stuff. But a reasonable assumption would be that they didn't test it because it was duplicative, and it could be reasonably inferred that there would be, the results would be similar to other items tested in the exact same area. So it's not a burden that can't be overcome. It's something that if there was a better budget and everything could be tested, this wouldn't be even an issue brought up. But I don't think it's going to make a lot of ground for the defense. It's just the defense will continue to poke holes in the investigation in an effort to show some flaws are made, and then use that in their argument later in this case.
And I guess it does beg the question, whose decision is that? If the prosecution does send, let's say, 10 items, is it an analyst's job to decide these items should be tested and these items shouldn't? Or are they obligated to test the ones that they are sent within at least that prohibitive amount of 10?
Well, I will say, in my experience with the district attorney's office, they send items to be tested that they deem relevant to the case, and they want those items tested. There is a policy that the TBI has, just because of the sheer volume of work and the limited amount of resources they have, where they are exercising some discretion. And it ends up becoming problematic in the discussion we're having right now. I've had drug cases where they have tested 3 types of drugs, but not 2 other kinds of drugs that were being sent, because they thought, whatever the reason might be. But in a murder case with a high priority on murder cases, I think all the items that are sent should be tested. Certainly the district attorney did not request that there's a limited number of items to be tested. They wanted everything tested that they sent. The TBI made a decision, and hence we're talking about it. But I don't think it's going to have a big impact on the theories of the case moving forward. This is just more of the jostling back and forth between the 2 theories of the case by the defense and prosecution.
Before you go tonight, Bill, I want to get your take on the medical examiner, his long day of testimony here today. One of the things we heard about a lot, the fetal position of the body in which she was found in that suitcase, and the fact that Dr. Cogswell believes that most of those wounds, those stab wounds, were given to Jasmine Pace while she was in that same position because of where the wounds were. And then at the end, the defense bringing up and asking, does this show a lot of emotion to have a large amount of wounds within that one area? What's your take on how some of that played out today?
Well, you could see a little bit from the prosecution side that they're trying to establish the fact that she was in a fetal position, maybe perhaps was even bound at the time. That would be an inference in an argument later on to talk about the premeditated. She was bound, and then the stab wounds took place. So that's kind of playing into their theory. The defense on the other side, talking about the number of stab wounds, is talking about an emotional response. The mens rea, again, as we've said for several days, is going to be the key point. The defense is going to be pushing more of an emotional reaction, less of a methodical, premeditated act by the defendant. So we're seeing both sides kind of elaborate on their theories and finding different bits of testimony that they can use later in argument as persuasion with the jury.
All right, so much to hear tomorrow. We know the prosecution will probably wrap up tomorrow, and then the defense, it'll be their turn. Do you still feel like Jason Chen will probably take the stand? That'll be a personal decision by the defense team, but given the position they've taken in this case, I think the only one that can really say what happened inside that argument, inside the apartment, is going to be the defendant. I would expect him to testify. All right, Bill, thanks so much for your time tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow.